Right. So while we're waiting for people to join, I'll have my 2 minutes to promote two things. First of all, the survey that I introduced in the last session, that's the survey launched by the General Federation of Trade Unions Educational Trust and SOAS Economics Department. Um, it's a survey on trade union education in Ireland and Britain. So it's open to all workers. You don't have to be part of a union and you don't have to be a British citizen or Irish citizen. And you also don't have to be like currently employed. You can be currently out of work. So it's basically open to all workers in Britain and Ireland, including Republic of Ireland. We want to know your experiences with trade unions and trade union education and your future interest in political economy. So I'll type in the link to the chat box. Please take part. We are already just shy of 600 responses in just over 2 weeks since the launch. So that's really exciting. I hope everyone gets to have a say. And secondly, one of the courses at the GFTU is politics and the economy. It's one of the three-parter series of courses. So this one is running at SOAS on the 25th of February. It's a one-day course in person. We'll be talking about political economy and what that means to trade unions. And there are only a few spots left, so I hope you can join. If you're part of a union that's an affiliate to the GFTU, you can attend for free. So definitely check it out. I will send the links to the chat now. Yeah. And I think we are good to start today's session. I will introduce our chair who will be leading the discussion today, and the chair will introduce the speakers. So today we are very happy to have the chair, Surbhi Kesar. So Dr. Surbhi Kesar is lecturer at the Department of Economics at SOAS University of London. Her research areas include informal economy, processes of structural transformation, and capitalist transition in labor surplus, uh, less developed economies, issues of economic and social exclusion, identity, labor, and work, and decolonized approaches to economics. She's a coordinator for the Economic Development Working Group of the Young Scholars Initiative of the Institute for New Economic Thinking and a steering group member for the Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics Initiative. She's also an editorial board member of the Review of Political Economy Journal. So without further ado, I'll give the floor to Surbhi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vani. I'm really excited to be chairing this session today on immigration and labor. And we are joined by two fantastic speakers with us today. We have David Bacon and Hannah Cross. I will briefly introduce what is it, sort of lay the land to place these talks, and then we will go first and hear from David, followed by Hannah, and I'll introduce the speakers briefly. So, I mean, I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on this particular issue today because it seems to be one of those issues for which right has a response that it does, but it is a response on which the political left needs to have much more deliberation and articulation of how to think about it. And how they think about it in different parts of the world is, in fact, quite different. We all are aware about capitalism being a crisis-ridden system, or at least having the tendency towards it. And we did see, capital looking to increase its profits in the 1970s with the whole crisis that was happening in the global north, particularly in the US as well, and migrating and looking for avenues in the global south where cheap labor could be made available. This of course, had ripple effects also in the global north, where the unions were busted, where, since labor's bargaining power went down, it of course had effect on living standards there. And now we are in a very important and interesting moment, few decades later, where exactly that labor of the global south that was made available for capital is something that is coming to haunt the sort of political accord in some ways that was struck at that time. And of course, this whole issue gets compounded by the fact of we've got, imperialist wars happening in different parts of the world and the kind of response. Of course, Global South has still been the biggest recipient of people from war-torn economies. But again, this is something that is now rising in the UK in terms of migration. And it is something for which the response has been quite varied across different fractions, but it is also something that the left, if one has to think globally in terms of what a left movement can be, has remained quite disparate, and sort of the articulation of that is much needed. So I'm really excited to be hearing from you to also help us articulate some of those thoughts. I will begin with introducing David and will hand over the floor to him for about 15 minutes to present his opening remarks. David Bacon is a California writer and documentary photographer, a former union organizer for 30 years. He has photographed documentary projects about labor, the global economy, war and migration, and the struggle for human rights in countries around the world, including Iraq, the Philippines, Honduras, Mexico, and the United States. He's the author of Illegal People: How Globalization Creates Migration and Criminalizes Immigrants, and The Right to Stay Home, and More Than a Wall. And these have spanned over 2008, 2013, and 2022. On that note, I will hand it over to David and request him to to deliver his opening remarks. Thanks, David.
Well, thank you, Surbhi. I appreciate the invitation and the chance to talk with fellow trade unionists and comrades in the UK and Ireland. And I'm going to talk about social violence and labor and imperialism, talking about specifically about Honduras. Fox News, our right-wing network here in the US, calls San Pedro Sula, a city in Honduras, the world murder capital, and our public radio labels it one of the most violent cities in the world. Meanwhile, though tens of thousands of Hondurans arrive in the US-Mexico border seeking refuge, for them the fear of violence is a completely legitimate reason for leaving home and making the dangerous journey north. Violence and gangs, however, are presented by US media as the only explanation for the exodus of Hondurans from this metropolis. Yet more than a century of history connects this city with the United States in a close but unequal and usually abusive relationship. Mass violence, which includes the social violence of exploitation and colonization, is at the heart of this relationship. Over that time, San Pedro Sula has been the capital of banana exports, a city racked by war and death squads, and a factory town for the garment industry. And most recently, it has become a community hit by deindustrialization as hard as any textile town in New England. It is this long relationship that has produced the migration with which the media seems obsessed. When Marine Corps General John Kelly was the commander of the US Southern Command under President Obama before his stint in the Trump White House, he framed Central American migration as a national security threat and called it a crime-terror convergence. And the gangs and violence became a justification for US funding of the Central American Regional Security Initiative, which supplied $204 million to the corrupt Honduran government for army and police in 2016 and 2017, and another $112 million for economic development. There is indeed violence in San Pedro Sula, but that violence has a long history, and it is intimately tied to the city's relationship with the US. That relationship is so close that the most basic decisions affecting the lives of its residents have often been made by powerful Americans. The first was Samuel Zamora, who founded the United Fruit Company, which is today called Chiquita Brands International. Zamora started as a banana importer in the US in 1898, and in 1910 bought 5,000 acres near the small town of San Pedro Sula, which he made the headquarters of his banana empire. When the Honduran government wouldn't give him land concessions and low taxes, Samori hired mercenaries, Machine Gun Maloney and Lee Christmas. And in 1912, they overthrew the president of Honduras. Samori developed the port of Puerto Cortes, 30 miles from San Pedro Sula on the Caribbean coast, to handle his cargo, and then a railroad to connect them. He ruled every aspect of the lives of people of the region, and even the U.S. Embassy called it a state within a state. Successive Honduran governments protected United Fruit. Banana workers organized a strike in 1920, for instance, and the U.S. sent a warship to put it down. In 1932, General Tiburcio Carlos Andino outlawed strikes and the Honduran Communist Party. Despite the repression, however, Hondurans organized one of the most active labor movements in Central America, starting on those banana plantations. A succession of generals governed Honduras from 1963 to 1981, taking bribes from United Fruit and tolerating the growing drug trade. During the presidency of Ronald Reagan, the United States began using the country as a base to fight to overthrow the Sandinista government in Nicaragua and to train the Salvadoran army to defeat the Farabundo Martí Front for National Liberation, or the FMLN, in El Salvador. Honduras had its own small guerrilla movement, and in 1982, leftist guerrillas took 100 businessmen and government officials hostage for 8 days in San Pedro Sula. The government sponsored death squads in San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa. The U.S. and the CIA and U.S. military advisors organized Battalion 316, which was responsible for murdering and disappearing more than 150 leftists and trade unionists from 1981 to 1984, one of them an American Jesuit priest, James Carney. Honduras's history of mass violence, both direct interventions by the U.S. and the violence of an oligarchy that the U.S. supported, created the conditions for exploitation, a form of social violence that made migration just as unavoidable as the fiscal violence itself. As the Central American wars ramped up, Honduras opened its first industrial free trade zone in 1976. Beginning in the late 1980s, after the wars ended, the U.S. Agency for International Development initiated a large program to develop export processing zones in San Pedro Sula. USAID financing paid for road construction, sewers, buildings, transportation, and the basic infrastructure for U.S. manufacturing. U.S. companies were then wooed to either invest directly in building plants themselves or to guarantee work to contractors to operate factories for them. By the 2000s, the country had become the 5th largest exporter of clothes to the United States. That production was concentrated in San Pedro Sula, which became the industrial heart of Honduras, and the goods were then shipped out through Puerto Cortes. San Pedro Sula became a factory town. Lining its main arteries were rough concrete buildings housing enterprises that sewed garments, packed shrimp, or ran injection molding machines churning out plastic parts. At shift change, young women streamed through the gates while men piloted the trucks carrying containers of merchandise to the nearby docks in Puerto Cortes. One of San Pedro Sula's workers, Claudia Molina, came to the U.S. in 1995 to describe conditions in the plants. She told me, "Our workday is from 7:30 a.m. to 8:30 p.m., sometimes until 10:30 from Monday to Friday. On Saturday, we start at 7:30 a.m., we get an hour for lunch and work until 6:30 p.m. We take a half hour again to eat, and then we work from 7 p.m. until midnight. We take another half hour rest, and then go on until 6 on Sunday morning. And working like this, I earn," she said, 270 lempiras per week, which is about $30. Workers organized in response, and the company fired 350 of them. When those who remained struck in protest, company managers called the police, who pulled the organizers out of the plant. Police kidnapped the general secretary of the union, threatening and beating him. According to Molina, she said they told him to turn over the names of the members of the union's executive board and that if he didn't, they would kill his family. The factory's main client was the U.S. garment company, the Gap. The U.S.-owned companies in San Pedro Sula were intensely preoccupied with the sex lives of young women workers. Doctors handed out contraceptives. They were not motivated by a concern for the reproductive rights of the women workers, however, but by the company's desire to keep women working on the production lines. When the doctor's pills made one woman on the line feel ill, she went to the public Social Security clinic. And at the clinic, they told her that she was pregnant, which she hadn't known, and that the pills she'd been given were to produce an abortion. At the time, women made up 84% of the workforce in the Honduran maquiladoras, over 95% of them younger than 30, and half younger than 20. They were at the point in their lives where they wanted to begin their own families. But to keep women from getting pregnant and leaving the factory to have children, USAID funded the Honduran Association for Family Planning, which established contraceptive distribution posts staffed by nurses inside the factories. In 2005, the U.S. and Central American governments negotiated a free trade agreement to protect the rights of foreign investors. When the Honduran Congress took up ratification, more than 1,000 demonstrators filled the streets of Tegucigalpa. After Congress ratified CAFTA anyway, and a vote at midnight, the crowd was so angry that the terrified deputies had to flee. In November of that year, progressive Honduran parties elected a president, Manuel Zelaya. They couldn't stop the implementation of CAFTA, but Zelaya announced a program of economic and social reforms, including raising the minimum wage, giving subsidies to small farmers, cutting interest rates, and instituting free education. All of these were measures that, by raising living standards, would have given people a future at home in Honduras. But in 2009, Zelaya was overthrown by the military and put on a plane out of the country. After a weak protest, the Obama administration gave de facto approval and more military aid to the coup regime that followed. If the social and political change that Zelaya was beginning had been allowed to continue, fewer Hondurans would have come to the U.S. in the following years. In Honduras, CAFTA required, that's the free trade agreement, required the privatization of state-owned assets to create investment opportunities for foreign corporations. Honduras's General Union of Dock Workers twice beat back the government's efforts to privatize the port of Puerto Cortés, mobilizing the whole town in the process. Despite this opposition, the coup government that replaced Zelaya privatized the shipping terminals in 2013 and gave a contract to a company from the Philippines to run them. As an incentive, it gave the company the freedom to fire workers who belonged to the union. When dock workers protested, the government sent in the army and arrested 129 people, charging them with terrorism. Attackers broke into the home of the union's general secretary, Victor Crespo, and a truck mysteriously hit and killed his father in front of their home, and Crespo had to leave the country. Radio Progreso in San Pedro Sula exposed an agreement between the Honduran government and the International Monetary Fund calling for cuts in the budget for education and healthcare, leading to the firing of teachers and healthcare workers and less money for buying medicine. The IMF demanded that the government hand over administration of public hospitals to private foundations and privatize the state-owned electricity and telephone companies. The government cuts were met by mass protests, including highway blockades by teachers and health workers. Police used tear gas against demonstrators, some of whom were wounded by gunshots and others were detained. In Tegucigalpa, teachers began a national strike with a march of 20,000 people. The tear and pepper gas that was used against them by the police was so intense that the clouds closed the international airport. The government of Porfirio Lobo, successor as president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, signed the agreements with the IMF and continued to roll back Zelaya's reforms. In 2018, U.S. prosecutors charged Hernandez's brother, Tony Hernandez, with transporting cocaine through Central America in cooperation with government officials. The drug trade that counts in Honduras, it seems, isn't the one in the Valle. This was a campaign of economic violence against the Honduran working class, and economic violence produced migration. As a migration-preventing strategy, that Central American Free Trade Agreement and this poverty wage economic model that was imposed on San Pedro Sula was a complete failure. The number fell. In 2014, the Border Patrol apprehended 90,000 Honduran migrants at the border, and by 2017, the number of children who were detained on the border reached 39,000. According to U.S. immigration policy, migrants who fear persecution can claim refugee status, while so-called economic migrants who flee poverty and hunger cannot. Yet for many young people fleeing San Pedro Sula, this makes no difference. People leave home because staying becomes untenable, often for a combination of reasons. They flee from the violence, they leave because they were laid off as teachers or nurses, or because they couldn't get an education for their kids, or medical care in a hospital. The Pew Research Center reports 96% of Hondurans deported from the U.S. say that they migrated because of grinding poverty. Even if you don't fear being beaten or murdered, you still don't want to die poor and hungry. Despite the mass violence used against them, the organizations that fought CAFTA and the Hernandez dictatorship did not stop organizing. In 2021, they campaigned for Xiomara Castro de Zelaya, who had been the First Lady of Honduras during Manuel Zelaya's presidency, and she won the election with a big majority. Castro de Zelaya was active in the National Popular Resistance Front after the 2009 coup, and she reinstituted Manuel Zelaya's social democratic economic policies and adopted a foreign policy independent and largely critical of the U.S. But under pressure from Trump, and with U.S. money buying the election, a new right-wing government has now taken power again in Tegucigalpa. Just before the election, Trump pardoned former President Hernandez, who had been convicted himself and imprisoned in Miami for his years of drug trafficking while in office. So when we think of the children in the immigration detention centers today, we might think of them as change agents. Our responsibility to them is to give them a world in which the choice to leave Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduras is truly voluntary, where they have a future with dignity if they choose to stay. The ability to stay home is as important as the ability and the right to migrate. The right to stay home, to not migrate, though, has to mean more than the right to be poor or the right to go hungry. Choosing whether to stay home or leave only has meaning if each choice can provide a meaningful future in which we're all respected as human beings. But the violence that the U.S. media found so shocking in San Pedro Sula has now come home. This year, Trump has made organized violence by the state more open than ever, bragging repeatedly of his willingness to use it. He intervened repeatedly in Venezuela, attacking boats at sea and killing their crews, alleging without evidence that they were carrying drugs, and then bombed Venezuelan cities and kidnapped President Nicolas Maduro and his wife Celia Flores. Violence has become a trademark of the Border Patrol inside the U.S. in seizing immigrants, detaining them without legal process, and sending them to third countries where they face torture. Over a dozen people have been murdered by them in the year since Trump took office. He called out the National Guard in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Portland, and in Chicago, heavily armed agents rappelled down from helicopters to a tenement apartment house, treating poor residents as military targets. Trump called Somali immigrants garbage and blamed migrants themselves for the violence to which they were being subjected. But despite the threats and the actual use of violence, people in the U.S. are no more willing to accept it than the people of San Pedro Sula. Protests against the Trump administration have increased all year, and demonstrations have spread across the country. Now, as the people of Honduras have faced, the people of the U.S. are also going to face efforts to rig elections this year for the corporate elite to stay in power. While some predict a heavy loss for the administration in these elections this fall, restrictions on voting and disenfranchising voters raise the possibility that even holding a valid election in the United States in the current environment of repression and violence may be extremely difficult, if not possible at all. Thanks.
Thank you, David. I will go right to Hannah to introduce Hannah Cross, who is a senior lecturer at the University of Westminster. She is a member, the former chair of the editorial working group of the Review of African Political Economy. She is also a founding member of the International Initiative for Promoting Political Economies Africa Working Group. Her publications include Migration Beyond Capitalism and Migrants, Borders and Global Capitalism, West African Mobility and EU Borders. She has also published articles and chapters on the global remittances agenda, migration and labor mobility in West and Southern Africa, and the CFA franc under neoliberal monetary policy. After that very interesting talk by David, I will request Hannah to please present her opening remarks.
Thank you, Surbhi. I'm really delighted to be invited to this talk. And I'm going to pick up on the introduction, really, particularly in terms of how the left can think about migration and the implications for workplace organising. So the main aim is to highlight some of the historical challenges and struggles in workplace organising and for the broader left. And these are based on how the capitalist class benefits from a weakened and divided majority. And this makes labour solidarity and internationalism a particularly radical but essential aim for the labour movement. So it sounds simple to sort of unite around it, but it's incredibly difficult. So I'm going to highlight some of these challenges. I'm going to discuss the role of the migration regime in capitalist development. So how it creates division and polarization within and between continents. And I'll focus on Africa and Europe in particular. But there are many parallels with the processes that David Bacon has just been talking about and that he highlights in his really outstanding book, The Right to Stay Home, in terms of the links between imperialism and displacement. So there are similarities here in these kind of South-North movements. The brutality of the migration regime that, I mean, we can trace it back to the First World War and the development of passports, but it's become particularly violent and brutal in this century. And the particular kind of inhumanity is in its basis of racialized population control as a response to people losing access to the necessities of life. So there are very minimal kind of market-led interventions sometimes to the causes of displacement, but these are often creating more displacement because they're these kind of free market policies that displace people in the first place. So, you know, with these very cosmetic efforts to kind of prevent displacement by bringing on development on neoliberal terms, at the same time, we see massive investment in migration control, leading to thousands of deaths every year. The losses that displaced people are facing are created by imperialist processes, and this is namely the destruction of productive forces and of the freedom of development in dominated societies. And this is common to migrations in North America and Europe. In today's context, we see processes of late imperialism linked with the rise of monopoly finance capital, declining US hegemony, rising world conflict, and growing threats to the ecological basis of society. We see extreme hierarchical relations, increasing domination by megacorporations, and a handful of very powerful states at the center of the world system who are leading in neo-fascist tendencies and at the same time arguably creating the prospects for socialism. So this all brings unfolding processes of global apartheid and siege, where we see people facing containment and extreme violence. The migration regime, beyond how it treats migrants, also shapes the social conditions for capital accumulation. And this is particularly based on the social relations of Western imperialism as a historical form of ideological domination. So the Western powers also exercise power through institutions like the International Organization for Migration, which drives international policy. Western regimes have also sustained their power over their domestic working class with political campaigns to constrain these forced migrations, creating social as well as territorial divisions that allow capital to thrive. And this has held back these societies' social development in Europe and the US. So in terms of understanding the particularly Western Europe and Africa migration regime, Lenin, as well as Rosa Luxemburg and her contemporaries, sort of saw the direction that we see today in Western imperialism, in that Western Europe's regional consolidation would also accompany violent militarist division of the world. That the ruling class within the European bloc would be able to extract wealth from dominated territories, and the working classes at the same time in Western Europe would be tamed under a new financial hierarchy. And this helps to explain the kind of powerlessness that we see in the working classes of the global north. The migration regime today between West Africa, the Maghreb countries, and Europe presents exactly this kind of territorial division. We see the blockage and destruction of patterns of circulation within Africa. This has really been increasing over the last 25 years. And this is done through, most recently through aid programs from the EU and European powers that incorporate the EU's border regime in national policies. It's a new kind of structural adjustment in that the kind of conditionality that comes with loans includes migration control, and this includes border posts, and it includes other ways to prevent mobility and circulation within Africa. So we see growing European and US border enforcements between African countries, and more recently this leads to displacement by border regimes. So if they're trying to prevent migration towards Europe, they are really failing at this. We can see this in the deal between Italy and Libya, where Libya was a country receiving labour migrants, and now, the sponsoring of militias currently being tried in the International Criminal Court is leading to new and chaotic refugee movements. There's also Tunisia's receipt of European aid as well, leading to the expulsions of thousands of West African workers from Cote d'Ivoire and other countries after it's followed Libya as the most important transit country. In Senegal, so this has been a source of thousands of migrations towards the Canary Islands and towards Spain by other routes. The cause of migrations, again with these parallels in America, is linked with the collapse of fish stocks, environmental destruction as a consequence of free trade agreements, and also the restriction of circulation patterns. So people don't have that safety valve to go to neighbouring countries, whether they are artisanal fishers going to Gambia or Mauritania, these kinds of options are closing down. And at the same time, towards the end of the last presidency in Senegal, that was Macky Sall's neoliberal regime, the border policy of the EU was internalised in the country, creating a new notion of irregular migrants, and also leading to the use of imported border units against protesters against the regime, again creating a new kind of displacement crisis. So we're just seeing growing displacements caused by the extension of the European border regime in Africa. So these border regimes have significantly affected regional politics. And in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, recent popular coups have established a new kind of agreement, the Alliance of Sahel States. And this follows, it's linked with the politics of imperialism in general, including having foreign military forces in those territories. But there is also a connection with the migration regime in that the economic community of West African states was broken up, particularly by aid going to Niger to make it kind of the European border guard to prevent migrations towards Libya. And one of the first things the Alliance of Sahel States did was to reverse these legal restrictions that criminalize migration and to allow movement through the country again. But also it created new kind of border closures. So this is the kind of dynamism in the region. A general, very powerful, popular anti-imperialist movement, and at the same time, efforts to sustain sovereignty against military and economic imperialism, as well as the imperialism of the migration regime. So, in terms of thinking about progressive responses to these patterns, parts of the left talk about a kind of threat of population bombs and what this might mean. You know, they use these kind of terms, looking at the chaotic effects of late imperialism. You know, like what is the labor movement going to do with these growing masses of people? The idea of a threat of mass immigration, but it's really a mistake to anticipate these kinds of dramatic changes to ever turbulent global migration flows, particularly south-north patterns, and see this as a problem. It's a speculation in times of unprecedented instability. Most people want to stay home, you know, is clear in any migration research. And it's important not to see these flows just as a response to displacement, but they are produced in the unfolding processes of apartheid and siege that have accelerated in this century. They're a construction of the migration regime rather than something that's kind of rendering countries helpless. So we can't see the US and Europe as kind of being helpless against global disasters, but instead they're obstructing regional forms of circulation and labour mobility. And they've broken up integration projects. So if I just have a minute, don't I? So as a response in the global north, then labour internationalism is clearly the response, you know, recognising that the development of countries in the global north can't be isolated from the role of imperialism and migrant labour in their economies. The role of the state in sustaining national prejudice and division is a challenge for trade unions, especially those that are closely tied with the state or political parties. And the left needs to depart from kind of value judgments or the idea that migration is good or bad. You know, this is not helpful, understanding that it's a coercive movement. And it's often rooted in what's good or bad for the nation, you know, looking at things like democracy, labour or growth. So it really requires an internationalist mindset in terms of labour. The links between migration and imperialism require labour organising for the freedom of dominated societies, as Marx argued in relation to the Irish question, particularly how Irish workers displaced by English colonialism were forced into intense competition with English workers, and their hostilities were encouraged and aggravated by the state. So in that sense, the national emancipation of a colonized territory, you know, a dominated territory, is not a question of abstract justice or humanitarianism, but also a condition of social emancipation for all. So in thinking of alternative conceptions of migration, to conclude, then, you know, migration could be seen positively as breaking down national barriers and prejudices. It could potentially depolarize regions if it's understood in a spirit of economic cooperation and solidarity. And it can complement the productive aims of both sending and receiving countries. So, you know, thinking of an anti-imperialist migration regime means looking at the paradigm in a completely different way, moving away from the individualism, and looking particularly at justice in the international system. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. Both very insightful talks, and I have a lot of questions, mostly in terms of how is it and where is it that we build the movement towards. So, I mean, one thing that Hannah, you sort of ended on with and kind of came through in the description of David's study as well. I mean, one thing that is quite sort of unresolved today is that there is the identitarian lines and the working class, and the political class, Hannah, as you're saying, is like is used by the right wing to sort of pit one versus the other. That is, it's not something that's new. It is something that has been used by governments across the world in various times. How is it, especially in a moment like today, when one wants to incorporate the idea of identity-based differentiation also that does exist in a big way, but how does one incorporate that within a left working class movement? I'll throw a couple of more thoughts in the to the panel, and whatever you may want to respond to, I'll let you do that. Second is in terms of that, is it possible I mean, you spoke about an internationalist agenda and an internationalist view of looking at it, but is it at all possible to resolve this current crisis of capitalism with the idea of nation state as it was born? I mean, as it exists today, right? And the reason I ask that is because I think for the trade union movements, it is a very real question. You want to talk about imperialism and you want to talk about the internationalist issue, but there is also a short-term issue of there is competition from, the next country who will be able to absorb labor at the cheapest rate. So you want to protect jobs which exist within the country. So it is sort of kind of asking the question of, okay, should we allow and be ready to give up short-term gains that are much needed for this longer-term win? And how do we build from short-term towards the long-term? Um, the third question I had was like also to speak a little bit more to the current moment, right? Because I feel like that's what the Palestine moment has done today, is that it's first of all exposed to us that actually, of course, there's extreme forms of colonialism and genocide, but we're also talking about Venezuela, Cuba, and other countries which are I mean, which kind of makes us think about, we often think about how did they get away with colonialism, when we think about other forms of colonialism that existed. And now we see this whole thing playing out sort of again in front of our eyes. So, what does today's moment bring to us in terms of possibilities? So, those set of questions are more like to speak to the political moments. And I'll throw one last question, which is a little more theoretical for us to think through, which I hope you can, provide us some thoughts with as well. I mean, another, and David, your idea about the deindustrialization and the decline of the textile sectors, etc., that has happened, we're also seeing, like in general, there's an increase in capital intensity. From the point where labor was needed and this factor of production was needed for production, to now the conversation becoming about, oh, how do we absorb this labor? And it's the problem is to a different extent in different parts of the world. We're talking about the developed world where the problem comes in terms of, oh, the immigrants taking away the job and therefore not allowing to maintain a good wage rate. But then also we're talking about the developing countries where there's just so much surplus labor that exists. So in that sense, from the old Leninist and I mean, not necessarily Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg, but debates that they talked about in terms of the economic need of capital to actually go and bring in all these other quote unquote spaces which aren't within the circuit of capital within it, is also something that tends to be breaking today, where the whole population, where the global population of labor that you think about it, is in some ways become superfluous to the needs of capital. I don't know if a Luxembourg sort of, it provides a market for produced goods still exists and to what extent. But at least in terms of wage labor, it does seem to be declining. And that is something that we see happening. And even under colonialism, like the population that was not needed in the Europe was shipped off to, you've got from Europe going to Australia, to US, to Canada, and so on and so forth. But we are again in moments like this when we are talking about a labor surplus. It might not be well distributed across the world, but how do we then now think about, can we at all think about a working class movement or a labor movement on today's thing, or do we need to even rethink those categories of to what extent the left movement also needs to go beyond the category of labor as we use it? So those two, political moment and those theoretical question, I'll leave to the panel and let them come in and respond to it. David, would you like to go first?
I was actually going to ask Hannah if she wanted to go first, but since I went first before, but it's up to you.
Hannah, if you're up for it, I'll let you go first, and then we can come back.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Now, you started off asking about identitarian movements. I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but I think what's important is to recognize how division is kind of actively pursued by the state, in various forms. It can be racialized division, gender, sexuality, all kinds of divisions. We can often see a kind of top-down process that in neoliberalism has become very sophisticated. And I gather you're asking how to handle this within a working class movement. And I think it's exactly by that way, recognizing the source of these divisions, and looking for common interests, and recognizing the kinds of oppressions that exist within the labour movement. I can say that unions that I'm aware of, have not always been very good on understanding this, particularly dealing with racism in the workplace and so on, and the kind of methods that they pursue are often not thought out in a structural sense, and how this interacts with class. So I think it needs a very careful approach, and an attentive one to all the oppressions that exist within capitalism and how they've been actively pursued, similarly with gender oppressions, and that unions do exclude this. So it's a really important question. And in terms of the difficulty of relying on cheap labour, and how do you respond to that immediately and kind of protect jobs, perhaps with the challenge for meeting labour shortages, and also that perhaps people need employment in that market. And I mean, what I try to argue here is to start off with the international labour movement, rather than having a kind of blanket, free movement or not kind of approach. I mean, the evidence is that borders actually create cheap labour. So in terms of borders in the West, they should be abandoned, and a completely abolitionist approach is required. They're completely unnecessary. But that can also go with efforts to have a wage for the job, rather than having these different kinds of precarious labour. And I think the question in the global south is to respect the sovereignty of countries that have still been dominated in imperialist processes. And there's often this kind of prescription for free movement there as well, in free trade agreements in parts of Africa. And this has to be managed by states, according to their customs and, customs processes and whatever else. So I think, there are various national questions, but in the rich industrialized countries, it's a case of closing those borders and recognizing that they are entirely detrimental to the working class. There's never an answer of bordering in order to protect a national working class, because it will only create more cheap labour and circumventions, trap people inside the country and so on. So there's strong evidence for that. In terms of the existing colonialisms in the world, I mean, from there, I think, the particular worry is not only the colonization that we see in Palestine over a long period, and the new kind of colonizing processes of the US, but its links with the migration regime in terms of, the technologies it uses, the surveillance and so on, the different forces, the way it's militarized. So it's another reason to say that the migration regime affects everybody, and it could lead to new kinds of containment and oppression, following that exact model. So there's a very convincing kind of analysis of the way these models might be applied elsewhere in the current moment of late imperialism. So, and if I can just answer on the labour surplus as well. I mean, I think it's very difficult to determine what is surplus, because I suppose the existence of that labour gives employers power, even if it's not being used. It's the fact that it's always the fact there's a pool of labour. But I think there's the other dimension, which is that its existence also creates the social divisions for capital accumulation to continue. And there's also, there's other forms of accumulation in terms of the use of biometrics and, all the technologies applied to control populations. So in that sense, I think even if people are not working and they are destitute or in transit or whatever, they are always making profits for capital. And in that sense, they are being used by the market in various ways.
Thanks, Hannah. David?
I think I'll talk specifically as much as I can about in response to the questions about how the labor movement especially responds to migration and displacement. I was a factory worker and a union organizer for many, many years before I started doing the work I do now, and an immigrant rights activist during all that period of time. And the debate is a very, very old one. And it's not just in our labor movement, but I think in the labor movement, certainly in every industrial country, every colonizing country. And it's a debate about who is the working class of a country like the United States, to speak about our own country. And so the division, and it's a division not just and labor movement broadly conceived. In other words, this is not a debate just inside unions, it's inside socialist parties, it's inside the left. Do immigrant workers take the jobs of workers who are already living in the United States? Just the framing of the question itself implies that really what you have are you have two working classes. You have a working class made up of people who are already there, and you have a working class, or you have workers who are coming into the country who somehow don't belong to it. So those Honduran workers in San Pedro Sula, when they're in San Pedro Sula, they're certainly a big part of the Honduran working class. When they come to the US as migrants, are they part of the Honduran working class? Or are they part of the US working class? Where do they belong? And how we answer that question is the dividing line in our labor movement. You say that we have to move beyond Hannah, that it's not really useful to think about is migration good or bad? And I think that's absolutely true. That's not what our responsibility is as a labor movement. We have to think about how to advance as the working class of our country. We want to live in a socialist country eventually, but in the meantime, we also have to just fight the battles that are going to get us there. So the first thing to recognize is that in an imperialist world, migration is a permanent phenomenon. It doesn't stop. It is as old as capitalism is, the displacement of people. And so the response to it doesn't make sense for working people, for workers, to think, well, is migration good for us or migration bad for us? Really where that question leads to is really the exclusion, because the choice that unions especially, but also political organizations of working people have to answer is the answer to the attack on workers by capital to organize workers and to fight as much as possible as a united force to try to fend off those attacks and make progress? Or are we going to exclude part of the working class and say that the answer to how to move forward is to get rid of those workers who are competing against us for jobs? And right there, you have that division. And you're also sort of pretending that migration is something that you can stop. I sometimes wonder, if we lived in a socialist world, would there be migration? Would people go from country to country? And sometimes I think, well, okay, I think the movement of people is sort of hardwired into us as human beings. We want to be able to move around our world, and we can do it much more easily now than we ever could before. But in terms of the world that we actually live in, which is an imperialist world, migration is produced by the displacement of people. It's either direct displacement, as we were talking about in San Pedro Sula, the free trade agreements, or the wars that are sending people into the Mediterranean to drown, which are the legacy of colonialism, really. So it all goes back to living in this imperial world. And what that really means, I'm not saying that we cannot stop the efforts of the United States, for instance, to impose structural adjustment and free trade agreements on Mexico and Honduras and Central America, with their disastrous consequences for the people who live there. I think we fight about that all the time. And in some ways, there is this sort of self-interest argument that gets raised in unions here that, well, we need to fight against those free trade agreements because what they do is they displace people and they're going to come here as migrants and they're going to compete against us for jobs. And there's a certain truth and a certain reality to that. But at the same time, again, you are accepting this idea that the migrants who come are somehow people that, if we had our ability to do it, we would stop and keep out, and that the problem with the trade agreement is what it does to us in the United States rather than what it does to the people in the countries where those agreements are being imposed. So, this is a really difficult debate in the United States, because in our unions and in our politics, we have such strong voices saying that the jobs belong to us. That we have to defend our jobs against other workers. And you have, where that leads to is, the last election in the United States, we had Kamala Harris criticizing President Trump for being insufficiently anti-immigrant because he didn't support a bill that would have increased the numbers of the Border Patrol and set up new detention centers. And that supposedly is the political party that we had to support in order to defeat Trump. And clearly, with that argument, it was not a lot of people either wanted the exclusion argument and went for the gold and voted for Trump. Why vote for a halfway measure? Or you have people who are angry at it in the labor movement and among workers who simply didn't vote at all because they couldn't bring themselves to vote for that. So, the consequences of this debate are really enormous. And, this last one gave us Trump. What is the answer to it then? And I don't think there is an easy answer. Really, my experience as an organizer and as a factory worker is that, in the end, workers have to understand politics. They have to understand political economy. They have to understand what is happening in Mexico and what impact it has on people in the United States. And then look at solidarity and look at mutual support as being the answer to that. But that's not an immediate something that you can kind of produce overnight. It's a long process, and you have to fight for it every inch of the way. But what we're talking about is trying to build an aspect of class consciousness among workers, which is consciousness of what produces migration, consequence, consciousness of who are the workers around me. Are they my fellow workers, or are they divided into my fellow workers and those other ones who are trying to do me in by taking my job and therefore should be, sent back where they came from. So all I guess I'm saying is that, the answer to it is the workers have to understand the world better and then be able to make good decisions based on that. But it's not an easy thing to fight for.
Thanks, David. Thanks. Yeah. Okay, we have quite a bit of time to take questions from the audience. We do have one question, but in the meanwhile, please do put in your questions in the chat so that we can all collectively think about one of the most important issues of our time.